Margaret's fingers trembled as she traced the gilded frame, her breath forming small clouds in the cold attic air. The portrait had been watching her for 3 days now, or at least that's what her fractured mind kept insisting. The woman in the painting bore an unsettling resemblance to her own reflection, down to the same haunted green eyes and the peculiar scar above the left eyebrow. But this portrait was dated 1847, nearly 2 centuries before Margaret's birth. "You're losing it," she whispered to herself, the words echoing in the dusty silence. Yet every time she turned away, she could feel those painted eyes following her movements, boring into her soul with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The inheritance from her great-aunt's estate had seemed like a blessing, a Victorian manor filled with antiques and memories. But now, standing in this forgotten corner of the attic, Margaret wondered if some inheritances were meant to remain buried. What she didn't know was that her reflection was about to become her greatest enemy. The psychological thriller began 3 weeks earlier when Margaret first set foot in Thornfield Manor. As an art restoration specialist, she'd seen countless portraits throughout her career, but none had ever made her question her own sanity. The painting depicted a woman in Victorian dress, her pose elegant yet somehow predatory, with an expression that seemed to shift between serenity and malevolence depending on the viewing angle. The nameplate read, "Evelyn Thornfield, 1847." But the resemblance to Margaret was so uncanny that visitors often mistook it for a contemporary self-portrait. Margaret's rational mind attempted to dismiss the similarity as a coincidence. After all, the Thornfield bloodline ran through her family tree. But as she spent more time in the manor, cataloging the estate's contents, she began experiencing episodes of missing time. She would find herself standing before the portrait with no memory of how she'd gotten there, sometimes discovering pages torn from her restoration journals scattered at her feet like fallen leaves. The twisted story deepened when Margaret discovered her great-aunt's hidden diary in a secret compartment behind the portrait. The entries, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, detailed disturbing encounters with the woman in the painting. Her great-aunt Cordelia had become convinced that Evelyn Thornfield was somehow communicating with her, whispering instructions during the dark hours of the night. The final entry, dated just days before Cordelia's mysterious death, contained a chilling revelation. "She wants to come back. She's been waiting for the right vessel, someone who shares her blood, her face, her soul." Margaret's hands shook as she read the words, but her analytical mind fought against the supernatural implications. Sleep deprivation and isolation could explain her recent episodes, she reasoned. The stress of managing the estate, combined with the eerie atmosphere of the old manor, was simply playing tricks on her psyche. Yet as she closed the diary, she caught her reflection in the portrait's glass, and for a split second, she could have sworn she saw Evelyn's cruel smile staring back. The unreliable narrator within Margaret's mind began to fracture as the days blurred together. She would awake to find Victorian clothing laid out on her bed, garments that hadn't been there the night before. Her modern clothes would disappear, replaced by corsets and bustles that fit her perfectly, too perfectly. When she looked in mirrors, her reflection sometimes wore these period clothes, even when she was dressed in contemporary attire. The boundary between past and present seemed to dissolve within the manor's walls. Margaret's journal entries became increasingly fragmented, sometimes written in her own hand, sometimes in an archaic script that matched the style of Evelyn's era. She began to suspect that someone was playing an elaborate psychological game with her, perhaps hoping to drive her from the property. But the isolation of the manor, situated miles from the nearest town, made such a conspiracy seem impossible. The dark secrets of Thornfield Manor were revealing themselves slowly, like poison seeping through ancient walls, and Margaret felt herself becoming both victim and perpetrator in a mystery she couldn't comprehend. The mind-bending story reached new heights when Margaret discovered that her great-aunt hadn't been the first to experience these phenomena. Hidden in the manor's library, she found newspaper clippings dating back decades, documenting the strange deaths and disappearances of previous Thornfield inheritors. Each victim had been found in a state of psychological collapse, speaking incoherently about being possessed by the portrait or becoming someone else. The pattern was consistent and terrifying. Young women of the family line would inherit the manor, spend time with the portrait, and gradually lose their grip on reality. Margaret's professional training in art history provided a rational framework for understanding the psychological impact of art on the human psyche. Portraits from the Victorian era were often designed to create psychological intimacy with the viewer, using specific techniques of composition and expression. Perhaps the combination of isolation, family history, and the power of suggestion was creating a perfect storm of psychological manipulation. But even as she formulated these theories, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something genuinely supernatural was occurring, something that transcended rational explanation. The plot twist emerged when Margaret realized she was no longer sleeping in her assigned bedroom. Each morning, she would awaken in what had once been Evelyn's chamber, surrounded by Victorian furnishings that seemed to materialize overnight. Her modern belongings would be gone, replaced by items from the 1840s, a silver brush set, leather-bound books, even a diary written in her own handwriting but filled with thoughts and experiences from Evelyn's life. The entries described a woman consumed by jealousy and rage, someone who had died violently and refused to accept the finality of death. Margaret's reflection in the antique mirror began to show troubling changes. Her posture became more rigid, her expressions more calculating. She would catch herself speaking in Victorian phrases, her voice taking on an accent that wasn't her own. The transformation was subtle but undeniable, as if another personality was slowly overtaking her consciousness. When she tried to leave the manor, she would find herself turning back, drawn by an invisible force that made departure impossible. The mystery unraveled in her mind like a thread pulled from a tapestry, leaving her questioning which thoughts were truly her own. The psychological conflict intensified when Margaret discovered that Evelyn Thornfield had been murdered by her own sister in 1847, a crime that had been covered up by the family to avoid scandal. The sister, consumed with guilt, had commissioned the portrait as a memorial, unknowingly creating a focal point for Evelyn's unfinished business. The cycle of possession had continued for over a century, with each victim ultimately losing their identity to the vengeful spirit. Margaret's journal entries from this period revealed a woman at war with herself. Some passages were written in her own voice, desperately trying to maintain her sanity and identity. Others were penned in Evelyn's archaic style, filled with bitter recriminations and plans for revenge against the living. The handwriting would shift mid-sentence, as if two different people were fighting for control of the same pen. Margaret began to understand that she wasn't just viewing a portrait, she was becoming it, her consciousness slowly merging with that of a woman who had died in hatred and refused to find peace. The twisted story reached its climax when Margaret realized that she could no longer distinguish between her own memories and those of Evelyn Thornfield. She would remember events from the 1840s as if she had lived through them personally. The betrayal by her sister, the moment of death, the centuries of waiting for the right descendant to claim the inheritance. Her modern life felt like a dream, while the Victorian era became her reality. The portrait had become a window between worlds, and Margaret was trapped somewhere in between. The unreliable narrator within her mind began to question everything. Was she Margaret experiencing Evelyn's memories, or was she Evelyn recalling a brief period of believing herself to be someone else? The boundary between past and present, between self and other, had completely dissolved. She would spend hours staring at the portrait, watching as her reflection and the painted image seemed to merge into one entity. The dark secrets of the manor were no longer hidden. They were living within her, transforming her into something that belonged neither to the 19th century nor the 21st. The mind-bending story took an unexpected turn when Margaret discovered that her great-aunt Cordelia had found a way to fight back against the possession. Hidden in the manor's basement, she uncovered a second portrait, one of Evelyn's sister, the murderer, painted in the same style and by the same artist. The sister's expression was one of eternal torment, her eyes filled with guilt and fear. Cordelia's notes revealed that the two portraits were connected, locked in an eternal struggle between victim and perpetrator, with each subsequent generation of women becoming pawns in their supernatural conflict. Margaret realized that she had a choice to make. She could surrender to Evelyn's influence and become another victim in the cycle, or she could find a way to break the pattern that had claimed so many of her ancestors. The psychological thriller had become a battle for her very soul, with the outcome depending on her ability to maintain her sense of self in the face of overwhelming supernatural pressure. But as she stood between the two portraits, Margaret began to wonder if she was already too late, if the woman staring back at her from the mirror was still herself at all. The final plot twist revealed itself when Margaret discovered that she had been documenting her own transformation all along. The journal entries she had attributed to previous victims were actually her own words, written during blackouts when Evelyn's personality had taken control. The newspaper clippings about mysterious deaths were fake, created by her own hand to support a narrative that justified her psychological breakdown. The manor's staff, concerned about her deteriorating mental state, had been trying to help her, but she had interpreted their actions as part of a supernatural conspiracy. Yet, even as Margaret grasped this rational explanation, she couldn't shake the feeling that something genuinely otherworldly was occurring. The portrait continued to exert its influence, and her reflection still showed disturbing changes. Perhaps the truth lay somewhere between psychological breakdown and supernatural possession, a mystery that would forever remain unresolved. As she prepared to leave the manor, Margaret took one last look at the portrait of Evelyn Thornfield, and what she saw in those painted eyes would haunt her for the rest of her days. The truth about Margaret's fate remains shrouded in mystery, just like the portrait that may have claimed her sanity or her soul. Did she escape the manor's influence, or did she become another victim in a cycle of supernatural vengeance? The psychological thriller leaves us questioning the nature of identity itself, wondering where the line between self and other truly lies. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of this twisted story is how it forces us to confront our own fears about losing control of our minds and memories. What do you think really happened to Margaret? Was she experiencing a genuine supernatural possession, or was the portrait simply a trigger for a psychological breakdown that ran deeper than anyone realized? Share your theories in the comments below. I love hearing how these dark secrets affect each of you differently. If this mind-bending story left you questioning reality, hit that like button and subscribe for more psychological thrillers that will keep you awake at night. There are more mysteries waiting to be unraveled, more unreliable narrators whose stories will challenge everything you think you know about the human mind. Until next time, stay kind, stay sharp, and stay curious.